In 1975, two young men started a company in Albuquerque, New Mexico with a simple vision: to put a computer on every desk and in every home. 50 years later, that company, Microsoft, would become one of the most powerful monopolies in human history, dominating the personal computer industry so completely that the United States government would take them to court for anti-competitive practices. But how did they do it? What were the strategies, the decisions, the ruthless tactics that transformed a scrappy startup into a trillion-dollar empire that controlled over 90% of the personal computer operating system market? This is the story of how Microsoft became a monopoly and how Bill Gates orchestrated one of the most brilliant, controversial, and legally questionable business strategies in modern history. The year is 1975. A Harvard sophomore named Bill Gates and his childhood friend Paul Allen are staring at the January issue of Popular Electronics magazine. On the cover is the Altair 8800, the first commercially successful personal computer. Most people saw a hobbyist's toy. Gates and Allen saw an opportunity that would change everything. The Altair had a problem. It was essentially useless without software. It needed a programming language, specifically a version of BASIC that could run on its Intel 8080 processor. Gates and Allen had never actually seen an Altair. They didn't own one. They couldn't afford one. But that didn't stop them. Working around the clock at Harvard's computer lab, Gates wrote a BASIC interpreter for the Altair on Harvard's mainframe computer using an emulator that Allen had programmed to simulate the Altair's processor. They worked blind. When Allen flew to Albuquerque to demonstrate their software to Altair's manufacturer, MITS, it was the first time their code would run on an actual Altair 8800. The demonstration was scheduled for Ed Roberts, the founder of MTS. Allen loaded the paper tape containing their BASIC interpreter into the Altair. The machine whirred. The teletype clattered. And then, miraculously, it worked perfectly on the first try. This was the beginning of Bill Gates' reputation as a programming genius. The fact that this software worked on the first attempt, having been written on a completely different system, was extraordinary. But it also revealed something else about Gates: his confidence, his willingness to take enormous risks, and his absolute belief that he could execute perfectly under pressure. MITS licensed the software. Gates dropped out of Harvard. Microsoft, originally Microsoft, was born. But here's where Gates made his first brilliant strategic move, one that would define Microsoft's entire business model for decades to come. Instead of selling BASIC to MITS outright, Gates insisted on licensing it. MITS could use the software, but Microsoft retained ownership. This seems obvious now, but in 1975, it was revolutionary. Most software was either free, bundled with hardware, or sold outright. Gates understood something fundamental. Software wasn't a product. It was intellectual property that could be licensed repeatedly. You wrote it once and sold it thousands of times. Even more importantly, Gates negotiated non-exclusive rights. Within months, Microsoft was licensing BASIC to other computer manufacturers: Commodore, Apple, Radio Shack. Every microcomputer needed software, and Gates was positioning Microsoft as the universal provider. By 1979, Microsoft had moved to Seattle and employed 13 people. They were generating revenue of $2.5 million annually, almost entirely from BASIC licenses. Gates was 23 years old, but the real game was about to begin. In July 1980, IBM came calling. Big Blue, the most powerful technology company in the world, wanted to enter the personal computer market. They were working on a secret project called Chess, and they needed an operating system. IBM first approached Digital Research, the company that made CP/M, the dominant operating system for microcomputers. But negotiations fell apart, allegedly because Digital Research's founder, Gary Kildall, went flying instead of meeting with IBM executives, and his wife refused to sign IBM's non-disclosure agreement without modifications. IBM turned to Bill Gates. There was one problem: Microsoft didn't have an operating system. They made programming languages. Gates had 48 hours to solve this problem. What happened next has become the stuff of Silicon Valley legend and controversy. Gates knew that a small company called Seattle Computer Products had created an operating system called QDOS, the quick and dirty operating system, written by programmer Tim Patterson as a CP/M clone. Microsoft licensed QDOS from Seattle Computer Products for $25,000. They didn't tell Seattle Computer Products about the IBM deal. They simply said they needed it for an unnamed client. Patterson joined Microsoft to refine it. By December 1980, Microsoft bought QDOS outright for $50,000. $50,000. That's what Microsoft paid for the operating system that would become MS-DOS, the foundation of their monopoly. But the purchase price wasn't the brilliant part. The contract with IBM was. Against all conventional wisdom, Gates negotiated something unprecedented. Microsoft retained the right to license MS-DOS to other computer manufacturers. IBM could bundle it with their PC, but they didn't own it exclusively. This was the deal of the century. IBM was so focused on hardware margins and so confident in their brand dominance that they didn't see what Gates saw, that software, not hardware, would become the key to controlling the personal computer industry. IBM essentially handed Microsoft the keys to the kingdom. When the IBM PC launched in August 1981, it came with PC-DOS, IBM's branded version of MS-DOS. The computer was an instant success. But more importantly, IBM had made a strategic decision that would backfire spectacularly. They had built the PC using off-the-shelf components that anyone could replicate. Within months of the IBM PC's launch, something remarkable happened. A company called Compaq reverse-engineered the IBM PC's BIOS, the only proprietary component, and created the first IBM-compatible clone. They needed an operating system. They came to Microsoft, then came Dell, then Tandy, then hundreds of manufacturers, all building IBM-compatible PCs, all needing MS-DOS. Microsoft charged each manufacturer a licensing fee, typically $40 to $60 per computer. As the clone market exploded, Microsoft's revenue soared. By 1983, 2 years after the IBM PC launch, Microsoft had become the dominant operating system provider for personal computers. They had accomplished something extraordinary. They had created a monopoly not by building the best product, but by controlling the platform on which everything else ran. The numbers tell the story. In 1980, Microsoft's revenue was $8 million. By 1985, it was $140 million. By 1990, it would be $1.18 billion. MS-DOS was installed on over 100 million computers worldwide. Market share, approximately 70% and growing. But Gates wasn't satisfied. MS-DOS was a command-line operating system, powerful but difficult to use. The future, Gates knew, was graphical. And Apple had just shown everyone what that future looked like. January 24, 1984. Apple launches the Macintosh with its revolutionary graphical user interface. Users could point and click with a mouse. No more typing cryptic commands. Steve Jobs had brought Xerox PARC's vision of intuitive computing to the masses. Microsoft had been developing Macintosh applications since 1982. Jobs had given Gates an early look at the Mac to ensure Microsoft would create software for it. Gates saw the future, and he decided to copy it. In November 1985, Microsoft released Windows 1.0, a graphical operating environment that ran on top of MS-DOS. It was slow. It was buggy. It was barely usable. Apple's lawyers threatened to sue, claiming Microsoft had stolen the Mac's look and feel. But Gates had learned something from the IBM deal: play the long game. Windows 1.0 was terrible, but it put Microsoft in the graphical operating system race. And Gates had something Apple didn't: the massive installed base of MS-DOS computers. Windows 2.0 arrived in 1987. Still not great. Windows 2.1 in 1988. Better. And then, in May 1990, Windows 3.0 landed, and everything changed. Windows 3.0 was fast, stable, and actually usable. It supported 386 processors, which meant it could access extended memory. It had a polished interface. It could run multiple applications simultaneously. Within 2 weeks, it sold 1 million copies. Within 2 years, 10 million. Windows 3.0 was the turning point. It made graphical computing accessible to the masses because it ran on cheap, commodity hardware. The Mac was elegant but expensive. Windows was good enough, and it ran on computers people could actually afford. Gates had democratized the graphical interface, and in doing so, he'd locked in Microsoft's dominance for the next 2 decades. But operating systems were only half the story. Gates understood that to truly control the PC industry, Microsoft needed to dominate applications too, the programs people actually used to get work done. Throughout the 1980s, Microsoft had been developing applications: Word for word processing, Excel for spreadsheets, PowerPoint for presentations. Each competed against established leaders: WordPerfect, Lotus 1-2-3, Harvard Graphics. In 1989, Microsoft bundled these applications together into Microsoft Office for the Macintosh. The next year, they released Office for Windows. The bundling strategy was genius. Instead of buying 3 separate applications for $1,500 total, customers could buy the Office suite for $750. But there was another advantage, one that would later become the focus of antitrust investigations. Microsoft had access to Windows' underlying code. They knew exactly how Windows worked because they built it. This gave Office applications subtle performance advantages that third-party developers couldn't match. The strategy worked. By 1995, Microsoft Office had captured over 80% of the Office productivity suite market. WordPerfect, once dominant with 50% market share, collapsed collapsed to single digits. Lotus 1-2-3 was crushed by Excel. The application competitors had been eliminated. As Microsoft's dominance grew, so did their willingness to use controversial tactics to crush competitors. One of the most effective and ethically questionable was the strategic announcement of products that didn't actually exist yet. It worked like this. A competitor would announce a promising new product. Before that product could ship, Microsoft would announce their own competing product with superior features, scheduled for release around the same time. Customers would wait for the Microsoft product. The competitor's sales would collapse. Then Microsoft would delay their product, sometimes by months, sometimes by years. Sometimes the product would never ship at all. But by then, the damage was done. The competitor had lost crucial sales momentum and often went out of business. This became known as vaporware. Announced products that existed only as vapor, as marketing smoke. The industry coined a phrase, "Microsoft isn't done until Lotus won't run," referring to Microsoft's attempts to kill Lotus 1-2-3 through perpetual Windows updates that mysteriously broke Lotus compatibility. The vaporware strategy was incredibly effective. You didn't have to build a better product. You just had to make people believe you were building a better product. And because Microsoft controlled Windows, people trusted that our products would work better on our platform. It was anti-competitive, but it was legal, barely. But Microsoft's most powerful weapon wasn't vaporware or technical advantages. It was their contracts with original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs like Dell, Compaq, and HP, who built the vast majority of personal computers. These contracts contained clauses that would later become central to the government's antitrust case. The most notorious was the per-processor license, a licensing model that charged OEMs for every computer they shipped, whether or not it had Microsoft software installed. Think about what this meant. If you were Dell and you wanted to ship computers with a competitor's operating system, say DR-DOS or OS/2, you still had to pay Microsoft. You were essentially paying twice, once for the competitor's OS and once for Microsoft's and used license. The result was predictable. OEMs stopped offering alternatives. Why offer DR-DOS when you're already paying for MS-DOS? Why give customers a choice when it meant eating the cost of two operating systems? The per-processor license was classic monopolistic behavior. It used Microsoft's market power to foreclose competition. It didn't matter if a competitor had a better product. They couldn't get distribution because Microsoft had locked up the channel. When the FTC investigated in 1991, they found that these contracts had directly destroyed competitors like Digital Research. In 1994, Microsoft signed a consent decree with the Department of Justice, agreeing to stop using per-processor licenses. But by then, the damage was done. Microsoft had over 90% market share, and competitors had been eliminated. August 24, 1995, the most hyped product launch in technology history. Windows 95 debuts with a $300 million marketing campaign featuring the Rolling Stones' Start Me Up, Jay Leno hosting the launch event, and people lining up at midnight to buy an operating system. Windows 95 was genuinely revolutionary, a true 32-bit operating system with built-in networking, plug-and-play hardware support, and a radically improved interface with the now iconic Start button. It sold 7 million copies in the first 5 weeks. Within a year, it was on 40 million computers. But Windows 95 also marked the beginning of Microsoft's most aggressive monopolistic phase. The operating system came bundled with Internet Explorer, Microsoft's web browser. It was integrated so deeply into Windows that removing it broke the operating system, or so Microsoft claimed. This bundling strategy would spark the biggest antitrust battle in technology history. In 1994, a company called Netscape released Navigator, the first mainstream web browser. It was fast, feature-rich, and free for individual users. Within 18 months, Netscape had 80% of the browser market. Their IPO in August 1995 valued the 18-month-old company at $2.9 billion. Bill Gates initially dismissed the internet as a fad, but by late 1995, he understood his mistake. The web browser wasn't just an application. It was potentially a new platform that could render Windows irrelevant. If people did all their computing through a web browser, who cared what operating system they were running? Gates wrote an internal memo titled The Internet Tidal Wave, declaring the internet Microsoft's top priority. But Netscape had an 18-month head start. How could Microsoft catch up? The answer was simple. Use Windows monopoly to destroy Netscape. First, Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer with Windows 95. Free. Every Windows computer now came with a browser. Second, they integrated IE so deeply into Windows that OEMs couldn't remove it without breaking the operating system or violating their Windows license. Third, Microsoft pressured OEMs not to install Netscape. Documents later revealed in court showed that Microsoft threatened to revoke Windows licenses if manufacturers promoted Netscape. One email from a Microsoft executive stated, "We need to get Netscape out of the business of browsers." Fourth, Microsoft gave away IE for free, not just to consumers, but to internet service providers and content creators. They paid companies to use Internet Explorer. They used their Office monopoly as leverage, telling companies they'd get better Office integration if they standardized on IE. The strategy worked devastatingly well. Netscape's market share collapsed from 80% in 1996 to less than 50% by 1998. By 2002, Internet Explorer had 96% market share. Netscape was dead. May 18, 1998. The United States Department of Justice, joined by 20 states, filed antitrust charges against Microsoft. The case, United States versus Microsoft Corporation. The charge, illegally maintaining its monopoly in the PC operating systems market and attempting to monopolize the web browser market. The trial began in October 1998 under Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson. For the next year, the courtroom became a theater of American capitalism on trial. The evidence was damning. Internal Microsoft emails revealed a pattern of predatory behavior. One email from Jim Allchin, a senior Microsoft executive, stated, "I don't understand how IE is going to win. The current path is simply to copy everything that Netscape does packaging and product-wise. I am convinced we have to use Windows." Another email, from Bill Gates himself, asked, "Do we have a clear plan on what we want Apple to do to undermine Sun?" This referred to Microsoft's attempt to use its relationship with Apple to harm Sun Microsystems, another competitor. The government's case was simple. Microsoft had a monopoly in operating systems, and they had used that monopoly to eliminate competition in other markets, particularly web browsers. This wasn't just aggressive competition, it was illegal monopoly maintenance. Bill Gates' videotaped deposition became one of the most watched moments of the trial. The man who had built a trillion-dollar empire appeared evasive, argumentative, and defensive. He parsed words, claimed not to remember key emails he had written, and engaged in semantic debates over the meaning of common words. When asked about the term browser market, Gates spent minutes arguing about what market meant. When confronted with his own emails, he claimed not to recall writing them or understanding their context. The performance was so poor that it likely hurt Microsoft's defense. Gates' deposition was a disaster for Microsoft. Here was the smartest man in technology, the master strategist, and he came across as petulant and dishonest. The jury and the public saw a different Bill Gates than the visionary they'd been sold. They saw someone who would say anything to avoid accountability. On November 5, 1999, Judge Jackson issued his findings of fact. The conclusion was unambiguous. Microsoft had maintained its operating system monopoly through anti-competitive conduct. The company had bundled Internet Explorer with Windows not for technical reasons, but to eliminate Netscape. Microsoft had used its monopoly power to harm consumers and restrict innovation. On April 3, 2000, Judge Jackson found Microsoft guilty of violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. On June 7, he ordered the most dramatic remedy imaginable. Microsoft should be broken up into two companies, one for operating systems, one for applications. Microsoft appealed. The case dragged on. In 2001, the appeals court overturned the breakup order but upheld the finding that Microsoft had maintained its monopoly illegally. The case was sent back to a new judge for remedy determination. In November 2001, the Department of Justice, now under the Bush administration, reached a settlement with Microsoft. No breakup. Instead, Microsoft agreed to share its APIs with third-party developers, allow OEMs to install competing software, and submit to oversight by a compliance committee. Critics called it a slap on the wrist. Microsoft had been convicted of illegal monopoly maintenance, but the consequences were minimal. The company remained intact, its monopoly undisturbed. Ironically, Microsoft's monopoly was ultimately undermined not by antitrust enforcement, but by technological change. The company had dominated the PC era, but they missed the mobile revolution. While Microsoft fought to maintain Windows dominance, Apple launched the iPhone and Google developed Android. By 2020, mobile devices had surpassed PCs in usage. Windows still dominated desktop computers, but desktops no longer dominated computing. The platform had shifted, and Microsoft's monopoly strategy, control the operating system, control everything, no longer worked in a world of smartphones, cloud services, and web applications. Microsoft adapted. Under Satya Nadella's leadership beginning in 2014, the company pivoted to cloud computing with Azure, embraced open source, and stopped trying to force everything through Windows. By 2024, Microsoft had reclaimed its position as the world's most valuable company, but through fundamentally different strategies. So what was Bill Gates' secret strategy? How did Microsoft become a monopoly? Looking back across 5 decades, we we can identify the core principles that drove their dominance. First, control the platform, not the product. Gates understood that whoever controlled the operating system controlled the entire ecosystem. Applications, hardware, standards, everything depended on the platform. License the platform ubiquitously, and you become indispensable. Second, licensing over ownership. From the very first basic deal with MITS, Gates insisted on licensing rather than selling outright. This meant Microsoft could sell the same software thousands of times while retaining control and collecting ongoing revenue. Third, non-exclusive agreements. The IBM deal was brilliant precisely because Gates refused exclusivity. While IBM thought they were buying an operating system for their PC, Gates was building a universal platform for the entire industry. Fourth, play the long game. Windows 1.0 was terrible. Windows 2.0 was mediocre. But Gates kept investing, iterating, improving. He knew that controlling the GUI was essential, even if it took a decade to get there. Patience and persistence beat short-term perfection. Fifth, leverage the monopoly. Once Windows dominated, Microsoft used that dominance ruthlessly. Bundle Office with Windows. Integrate IE into the OS. Use OEM contracts to foreclose competitors. The monopoly became self-reinforcing. Market share begot more market share. Sixth, embrace, extend, extinguish. This became Microsoft's unofficial motto. Embrace industry standards. Extend them with proprietary features. Then use Windows dominance to make the proprietary version the standard, extinguishing competitors. Seventh, lock in customers and developers. Windows APIs, Office file formats, development tools, everything was designed to create switching costs. Once you'd invested in the Microsoft ecosystem, leaving became prohibitively expensive. This leaves us with an uncomfortable question. Was Microsoft's monopoly good or bad for society? The case against is clear. Microsoft stifled innovation, destroyed competitors, and used illegal tactics to maintain their dominance. They made computing more expensive and less innovative than it could have been. They were convicted of violating antitrust law. But there's another perspective. Microsoft did put a computer on every desk and in every home, exactly as they promised. They created standards that made software development more efficient. Windows, for all its flaws, democratized computing by making it affordable and accessible. And then there's Bill Gates, the philanthropist. Since 2000, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has donated over $70 billion to global health, education, and poverty alleviation. The fortune built on monopolistic practices now funds malaria eradication, vaccine development, and educational initiatives worldwide. This is the paradox of Bill Gates. He built his fortune through practices that were found to be illegal monopoly maintenance. He crushed competitors, stifled innovation, and harmed consumers. But he's also saved millions of lives through his philanthropy. Can both be true? Yes. Does the good erase the bad? That's a question everyone has to answer for themselves. Today, Microsoft is worth over $3 trillion. Windows still runs on over 1 billion computers. Office remains the dominant productivity suite. But the company Gates built has fundamentally changed. The lessons of Microsoft's monopoly remain relevant. In an age of big tech dominance, Google and search, Amazon and e-commerce, Apple and smartphones, Facebook and social media, the strategies Gates pioneered are being replicated. Control the platform, lock in users, leverage dominance into adjacent markets. The antitrust battles of the 1990s foreshadowed the regulatory challenges of the 2020s. Every dominant tech company faces questions about market power, innovation, and competition. Every CEO studies the Microsoft case to understand where Gates succeeded and where he went too far. Bill Gates himself has evolved. The aggressive monopolist of the 1990s became the thoughtful philanthropist of the 2000s. In interviews, he acknowledges Microsoft's mistakes while defending the company's contributions to technology. When asked about the antitrust trial, Gates has said, "In terms of being the focus of attention, I would have preferred a malarial fever." Yet he's also proud of what Microsoft accomplished, bringing computing to billions, creating an industry, changing the world. The truth is complex. Microsoft's monopoly was built on brilliant strategy and ruthless tactics, on genuine innovation and illegal behavior, on visionary thinking and destructive competition. Bill Gates was both a technological pioneer who democratized computing and a monopolist who crushed competitors. History will remember Microsoft's monopoly as one of the defining business stories of the 20th century, a case study in how markets can be dominated, how innovation can be both enabled and stifled, and how a single company's strategies can shape an entire industry for generations. The secret to Bill Gates' success wasn't technology. It was strategy. Control the platform. License, don't sell. Play the long game. Leverage dominance ruthlessly. And understand that in technology, the winner doesn't just take all. The winner defines what winning means. That was the secret secret strategy. That was how Microsoft became a monopoly.